I'm going to cut out my pattern pieces for the Colmar dress. I'm going to use the Lenox puff sleeves on the dress, and I'm also going to be putting the ruffles around the neck, and I'm going to be doing the V-neck version. So the ruffles will go down the back like so, and I will be putting the ruffle along the bottom. And so my ruffles will be out of the blue, while the dress will be out of this fabric. The Colmar pattern has a cutting chart in it for your rectangular pieces. So the V back bodice ruffle does not have a pattern piece, nor does the hem ruffle. So I'm making the size 3, so it has me cutting 3 pieces that are 2.5 by 15 inches. And for the ruffle, I need to cut 5 pieces that are 2 1/4 inches by 37 inches. So I cut my pieces here for the V-neck ruffle, and then I've measured out the 5 pieces for the skirt, for the hem ruffle. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut those out now. All right, I cut out all the pattern pieces. There are 2 pieces for the skirt, the sleeve pieces, the 5 ruffle pieces, the 3 pieces for the ruffle on the neck, and then we have the front bodice and the back bodice, and then this is going to be the casing for the elastic. We're going to start with sewing the ruffles for the V back bodice. You place the ruffles together, and you're going to be sewing along the short ends until you have one long ruffle strip. Next, it says to finish the seam with a serge or a zigzag stitch for professional finish, and then it also has you finishing the bottom seam or bottom edge with the serger or a zigzag. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I did serge the short end, and then I'm going to serge along the long end here, and it says try not to cut any of the fabric off. So now I'm on this step. I folded the fabric in 1/2 inch. It's actually right side to right side. See how it's there, right side to right side? And then you're gonna mark up 1/2 inch. You're gonna be sewing a line there. And what you're gonna be doing then is using that line to kind of inside it out or right side it out so that it makes a nice corner. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. So here I sewed that line, and now I'm going to take it and you're going to turn it inside, and you have it right side out now. And I'll take a tool and poke out that corner, and then we'll be measuring that up to 1/2 inch. So your hem's going to look like that. I'll continue to iron, and then it shows you how you have this line sewn all along the bottom of the ruffle. So I went ahead and stitched the hem for the ruffle, and it goes all the way down. So now I'm going to do the gathering stitch, and it says to do it at 1/4 inch from the edge. And on my machine for the gathering stitch, so this is a Brother machine, I just increased the stitch length to 5, which is the biggest it'll go, and I'll do that 1 row of stitching. The next step is to sew the shoulder seams together on the front bodice and the back bodice pieces. So you want to do that on your main and on your lining, and then afterwards you want to iron open those seams. So I went ahead and did that. I'm going to skip the part about attaching the ruffles to the armholes because we're going to be attaching sleeves a little bit later on, and I'm going to go down to attaching the ruffle to the neckline. So I had to quick redo the neck ruffle because I realized I used 3 pieces that were for the hem ruffle, which made it really long. So I redid it. There is my gathering stitch. Usually I will fold ruffles in half, mark the halfway point, and then start the halfway point here on the bodice front, and then gather the ruffles around. It's the same thing that you do when you attach a skirt to a bodice. So there's the center of my ruffle, there's the center of my bodice, and so as you can see, these ruffle pieces are pulled really tight. And now I'm going to slowly undo the gathers so that they reach the end of the V here, and distribute them evenly and attach with clips. So there's the neckline with the ruffle attached. I really like using these clips when I'm doing gathering because they're easy to remove and move instead of the pins. So now I'll go ahead and sew that down. Now it says to trim the seam allowance using pinking shears and carefully notch the curves without clipping past the seam line. So I'm going to use my pinking shears to trim this, and then where it's really curved, I'll cut some little slits with a pair of scissors. So I put some little cuts there where it's more curved and trimmed with the pinking shears. I'm now on this step where we will open up the bodice piece, and we're going to be matching the side seams and sewing them, and then you do the same thing with the back, matching it together and sewing it. So here's my bodice. I'm going to turn this over, flip this around, and we're going to be matching these two together here and sewing, and then you do the same thing with all the other sides. So there's the other side seam, and then the back, and with the lining as well. So I wanted to show what the side seams will look like. So that's those two sewn together, and then the lining sewn together. So that way when you flip it around, the two sewn seams will be on the inside. So, like so. So this is what it looks like once the side seams are sewn and the back seam is sewn together. Now the next step is to do the top stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and top stitch around here, and I clipped it down to kind of hold it in place while I top stitch. Now I'm going to work on the sleeves, so I switched over to the Lenox pattern and scrolled down to the puff sleeves. So it has you finding the center and then marking 3 inches to each side, and you're going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches. So I have my fabric here. My center already has a fold, so that was simple, and I'm going to put a mark and do the 2 rows of gathering stitches. So I sewed my 2 rows of gathering stitch, and then the pattern has you folding and ironing 1/4 of an inch up and then 1 inch. And from there it looks like we're going to sew the side seams of the sleeve together. And when we do that, you're unfolding this part here, sewing the side seams together, and then afterward it has you top stitching, you leave a space, and then it has you sewing another row of 3/8 from the first line of stitching. So you're kind of making a casing in there to pull the elastic through. So there's this small casing right here to do the elastic to have your puff sleeves. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm at this step here where I'm going to insert the elastic with a 1/4 overlap at the end and sew that together, and then sew the little opening closed. So here's my casings, and the elastic's going to go right here because that'll then make a little ruffle here. And I put the safety pin at the end, and I'm going to push it through. If you scroll down in the Lenox pattern, you'll come to the part where you are attaching the sleeve to the bodice. So they suggest that you line up this bottom of the sleeve with this bodice seam on the sleeve. So you're going to line those up, and then you also know where the middle of your sleeve is, and you're going to gather. Once this is inserted inside of the bodice here, you're going to gather it up to fit inside the sleeve hole. So I'm going to do that now, and then I'll show you. There's my sleeve. So I lined it up, I put a clip, and now I will pull these gathering threads to gather up my sleeve so that the rest of it can fit inside. And so you want to make sure that the right side of your sleeve is touching the right side of your bodice. You don't want to sew your sleeve on inside. So I have my sleeves attached with the clip on that side and on that side, and now I'm going to go ahead and sew. When I sew the sleeve on, I usually put my foot inside of the armhole, And then I move the fabric around and take the clips off as I sew forward because the sleeves are so small. The sleeves are attached. And now I'm gonna go back to the Colmar pattern and look at attaching the skirt. So here we go. So we're gonna take the circle skirt pieces, right sides together, and we're gonna be sewing them together. And then it has you doing a basting stitch. That's to keep this from stretching out. And then it looks like it wants you to skip down to attaching the ruffle to the skirt. So we'll get started on that. I sewed the short sides together for all of the ruffle pieces. And now I'm going to iron up for the hem. And it tells you on here to do a 1/4 and then a 1/4 and then an 1/8 of an inch for the seam. And then I'll put the 2 rows of gathering stitches. And there's the ruffle clipped onto the circle skirt. And that took a lot of work to gather those ruffles. So be patient. And there is the skirt with the ruffle attached and the top stitching. And then I finished off the seam over here with the serger. So we're at the step now where we are putting the bodice inside of the skirt. And then you have the right sides together, and I clipped around, and we're gonna sew that. And it says to sew it at just a 1/4 seam allowance, so a really small seam allowance. We're going to construct the facing. So you take your 2 facing pieces, you sew the inseams here. So I did that. And then you're gonna iron open those seams. And then it has you press one long end up a 1/4 of an inch with the wrong sides together. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So there's the facing, pressed it up a 1/4 of an inch all the way around. Attaching the facing to the skirt. So here is the facing. Line up your side seams. Right side of the facing is going to go to the wrong side of the skirt. You're gonna do a 1/2 inch seam around, and then you're gonna trim half of that seam off because afterwards this is gonna go folded up and you're gonna be putting elastic through. So you don't want all that bulk. So I'm now at this step where we will be sewing the facing, the top of the facing, to make a casing for the elastic. And so you're gonna pull your bodice out. You're gonna iron up your facing. I'm gonna pin it down to make sure it's nice and flat. And then you wanna sew around, and you're gonna leave a hole in which to insert your elastic. So I pin the facing down, and now it says to use a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So really small. And don't forget to leave that opening. So here is my casing for the elastic. And then I went ahead and went up to the size chart for the elastic for the waist to see how long I needed to cut my elastic. So I'm going to go ahead and insert that elastic through the hole, which I made at the back, and finish it up. And there is the finished elastic waist. And I closed up the seam at the back. And your dress is done.